Welcome to the final panel of our conference, Islam in Global Perspective. We have three wonderful presentations for you today, beginning with that by Dr. Adeel Malik, whose research focuses on exploring the causes and consequences of economic fluctuations in developing countries. His recent research has also looked at the comparative role of geography, trade, and institutions in driving long-run development outcomes. He has just successfully completed an Economic and Social Research Council project on investment, institutions, and growth. His empirical research combines a wide range of data sets, including both micro-level data on firms and aggregate data on developing economies. Dr. Malik is also a Globe Fellow in the Economies of Muslim Societies at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies and a research associate of the Center for the Study of African Economies. His previous research affiliations include the Department of Economics at Oxford University, Merton College, the Center for International Development at Harvard University, and the Mehboob ul Haq Human Development Center in Islamabad. Most recently, he has been working on and has published a paper called The Economics of the Arab Spring, which is a world development paper that received the Best Paper Award. Sitting beside him is Alex Strick von Linschoten, a graduate of the School of Oriental and African Studies. Linschoten first came to Afghanistan 6 years ago as a tourist, and in 2006 he founded Afghan Wire together with Felix Kern, an online research and media mentoring group to give a more prominent voice to local Afghan media. In spring 2010, he published My Life with the Taliban, for which he was a co-editor to Critical Acclaim, and is also co-editor of a translated volume of Taliban poetry. He is currently working on a book and PhD at the War Studies Department of King's College London on the identity of the Afghan Taliban movement. He is also finishing work on a very exciting project, the digitalization and translation for publication online later this year, of the world's largest collection of Taliban documents, newspapers, and archive materials. He's worked as a freelance journalist from Afghanistan, Syria, Lebanon, and Somalia, writing for Foreign Policy, International Affairs, ABC, the Sunday Times, the Globe and Mail, and the Tablet. He speaks Arabic, Farsi, Pashto, and German, and can get by in French and Dutch as well. He's based in Kandahar, Afghanistan, but spends time in London and Berlin. And finally, we also have Professor Mohammed Talib, who is a social anthropologist at the University of Oxford. He teaches and supervises research on the anthropology of Muslim societies and is a fellow at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies. His research focuses on Sufi groups, Tablighi Jamaat, and madrasas. His current research, madrasas in recent history, an alternative view between anthropology and international relations. In social anthropology, he has a monograph titled Writing Labor, Stone Quarry Workers in Delhi. And some of his recent articles include Modes of Overcoming Social Exclusion Through Education, analysis of 2 accounts from pre- and post-independence India. It's a pleasure to welcome all 3 speakers here, and I'm looking forward to hearing their perspectives on Islam, beginning with Dr. Malik, please.
Well, thank you very much for the kind invitation. This is a rather broad subject that I'm going to address primarily as an economist. I would like to first clarify the vantage point from which I'm speaking. It's a broader critique of a discipline that has gained growing currency in economics called the new institutional economics. It's the mainstream institutional analysis. And I try and build bridges to other approaches in political science, international relations. And the idea is very much relevant to this conference in the sense that I'm looking at the ways in which global and domestic power structures interact and shape institutional outcomes on the ground. However, I must warn that this is a very initial mapping of the field. It's not a comprehensive presentation. It's a vast subject, big canvas. So I'm just going to broach a few themes, and I hope it can elicit some interest in the discussion later on. Okay, well, the main subject of modern political economy is really trying to study the origin, development, and impact of institutions broadly conceived as institutions which are really rules of the game, plus the enforcement environment that structure human interaction. But many of these questions of institutional development have largely been explored as a self-determined process. So if you want to understand the quality of political and economic institutions in a country, they're largely determined within the sphere that you are studying. So a classic example is Why Nations Fail, a very influential book that summarizes large strands of literature. The external or global influences are implicit in the book, but they're not really spelled out. And that's very much true for modern political economy. Now, the puzzle in this paper, which I forgot to mention, is joint work with Professor Talib. It's kind of continuing a field of research amongst both of us. And it looks at the interaction between the internal and the external institutions. So how does the external environment shape domestic institutions? Now, rather than building a very deterministic account, we are interested in routine interactions, in the contemporaneous, continuous interactions between the internal and the external. And the examples that we principally draw on are from Muslim societies. Okay, well, the starting point is very much power asymmetry. So political economy is largely concerned about the asymmetric distribution of power within the domain that these studies look at. Now, we treat it as given, it's a basic premise in international relations, that some states have more power than others. So not only is power asymmetrically distributed within the confines of the countries that we study, but also across states. And although our main object is to look at institutional domain confined within national boundaries, one is clearly interested in the totality of power, and particularly de facto power, and how de facto power is composed of a range of influences, many of which are external. Now, clearly, in a globalized world, it is difficult to locate power in a fixed national space, and that we treat it as given. When we think about power, of course, there are a large range of studies that have thought about conceptions and components of power. It could be symbolic capital, economic, political, apparatuses of hard power. But regardless of its many constellations, power ultimately represents itself in de jure power, that has the sanction of parliaments, constitutions, so on and so forth, and de facto distribution of power. And in many cases, power itself is needed to stabilize asymmetries in any society. And in the final analysis, power produces a capacity, a condition, and it translates into enforcement, compliance by the actors. And of course, power can be reflected in important veto points within and across nations. And a key challenge in thinking about power is that in many cases, power conceals itself. Now, of course, there are two key myths that we would like to challenge and begin to challenge. And the idea behind these myths is that the border between the internal and the external is very porous. Now, one myth in the social science literature is that there is a huge divide between the colonial and the post-colonial periods. And we actually routinely mention colonial, post-colonial in our discussions. And the second myth is that all nation states are sovereign entities. And of course, now there is growing recognition that there are fragmented sovereignties in many of these states. Related to this is the idea that countries can be roughly divided into two types: those who can at best defend their sovereignty within their borders, and those who can also defend their sovereignty in overseas territories. Now, of course, here is an example of this divide between the colonial and the post-colonial. We believe that there's a time T when there was a structural break, and it was the end of colonial period, and then suddenly we enter into post-colonial phase. Part of this project is to actually question whether this timing of independence was really an episodic break in many of these Muslim societies, or whether there are patterns of structural continuity. Now, let us first define and try and understand what do we mean by external. And of course, there are many facets of foreign influences. There could be factors, drivers, actors. The external could be manifested in a durable entity, a power, a global power of sorts. It could be a network of different agents. It could be global norms that are diffused across boundaries, or global ideologies, whether it's about market capitalism, socialism, or indeed many other isms. External could also be manifested in the resources deployed by international organizations, whether development or for-profit. Or they could also be manifested in more observable phenomena such as hard military power, covert operations. And there are indeed several connecting nodes between these. There's circulation of capital, elites, treaties, pacts. So it's a very, very big domain to map. And the key challenge in mapping the external is that external is sometimes active, other times it's passive. Sometimes it's a condition, at other times it's a process. And often the external is masked in popular representations of power, as Professor Levin mentioned. Now, of course, there are gaps between the expression, reality, and the data. And it is difficult, particularly as a social scientist, to talk about these questions because you could easily get the delegitimizing label of conspiracy theorist. Now, of course, there are some domains where you can observe the data, such as foreign military presence, external intervention, foreign aid. But at other times, you need to interpret from science. I should, however, state and clarify at this stage that external is not necessarily equated with Western. It really depends on where you're located and what is your vantage point. So the region where we are sitting, of course, is a region where three kinds of resource flows move together. So foreign aid, remittances, oil prices, they tend to move together. And of course, when oil prices or gas prices rise, flows to other parts of the Middle East increase in the form of labor remittances and indeed foreign aid. And they could have dramatic impact on domestic institutional outcomes, and what I call, in economics, we typically describe those as neighborhood effects. Okay, in modern institutional analysis, external has been implicit, but largely as a historical phenomenon. Thinking about colonialism as an initial historical shock that shaped initial elites, shaped initial institutions, and those structures persisted through time. Or sometimes external is described as an exogenous technological shock, or a routine interaction between the internal and the external. Or indeed, as Charles Tilly will put it, the impact of wars on institutional change. And of course, there have been major strands in social science that have looked at the importance of the external environment. And prominent amongst these are the dependency school. We had some discussion around that yesterday. And of course, in modern IR, we have the world systems theory. But we believe that actually a lot of these schools of thought really give a deterministic account of the role that external powers play, whereas what we are interested in is essentially continuous contemporary interactions between the internal and the external. And therefore, we would exclude episodes of discontinuous institutional change, the role of sanctions. These clearly have an impact, and they're very obvious cases, but they can mask a lot of what takes place on an everyday basis. Now, of course, there's an emergent literature in political economy that looks at foreign influence, largely in the empirical domain. So there's some work by Tony Ayed et al., which looks at the impact of foreign powers on domestic policy choices, or how some foreign countries might have an economic interest for sponsoring coups, stabilizing dictatorships, or facilitating constrained democratization abroad, and largely to protect the FDI interests, foreign direct investment. There's other empirical work that has looked at democracy scores and the impact of US and Soviet interventions on decline in democracy across the world. There's also conceptual work where how a key trading partner might have an interest in keeping the incumbent in power. There's some recent work on the influence of IMF and World Bank programs and political regime transition. So there's growing to be more work on this, but hasn't been systematically integrated into mainstream political economy. Now, that leaves us to the question, how might this interaction, contemporaneous, continuous interaction between the internal and the external might shape outcomes on the ground? Well, here's how. I mean, there are a few illustrations. The first one is that institutional economics is very much concerned about persistence. Institutions are historically embedded and they persist through time. And the external can provide a mechanism for persistence because you have initial conditions, initial distribution of resources and institutions. They can interact with geopolitical influences after independence and lend a stability to the underlying structures. The illustration is really from Pakistan, how it's a country which had, right from very initial stages, a bureaucratic military structure of power, but this initial structure of power got strengthened and reinforced, entrenched in the system during the Cold War era. Okay, another way of thinking about integrating this into modern political economy is to really think about explaining continuity in the midst of change. There are lots of changes in political regimes, but things still remain the same. And in thinking about this, Acemoglu and Robinson, two scholars who have worked on this issue, have talked a lot more about the persistence of what they call de facto power. So although de jure power changes, de facto power remains the same. Now, what is de facto power? De facto power is the control over economic resources, the ability to solve collective action problems, and the control over means of violence. And it is easy to understand how the external environment can actually shape all three of these forces: control of resources, ability to arbitrate conflicts, and indeed control over means of violence, because in many cases, external powers have the monopoly over the means of sanctions. There's work, for instance, by Eva Berlin on robustness of the coercive apparatus in the Middle East. And she talks about the ways in which this robustness is partly embedded in global support structures. Another way in which the external might shape domestic institutional outcomes is that external influences can disrupt the process of institutional reform. And political economy thinks that actually in many states, the process of institutional reform is endogenously determined from within the societies. And oftentimes, the geopolitical logic of stability runs counter to the logic of endogenous institutional reform, which might create short-term instability before you can achieve stable outcome. And of course, we have lots and lots of examples about foreign aid where scholars perceive foreign aid as primarily geostrategic rents. So there's a lot of work on how geopolitical incentives drive these aid flows, how aid undermines political incentives in recipient countries. So, of course, the political incentive structure in Jordan, in Egypt, in Pakistan, lots of other strategic states is very much maintained by continuous inflow of foreign resources. And indeed, there has been burgeoning interest in understanding the determinants of civil war. In fact, the most recent issue of American Economic Review contains papers around how US foreign aid actually induced commitment problems in Africa and increased the risk of civil war. So there's growing literature on that account as well. Now, of course, external is not always a disabling influence. There are situations where this interaction can produce positive equilibriums. You have the example of Eastern Europe, where market integration served as a commitment device for local actors. You have studies and examples from Turkey, where Erdogan and the AK party in general used the EU accession criteria as a commitment device to bind the military and other forces, commit them to domestic reforms. There's also stuff on economic reform that inspired institutional change, and indeed Turkey and India are examples. So there are lots of different equilibriums that we are talking about. Another way in which the external might be important is the timing and sequencing of reform of events. Now there is a well-established literature in political science that talks about the importance of timing. Paul Pearson's idea of timing as timing of events, the sequence in which events are structured. And of course, there are key moments at critical junctures that can reinforce pre-existing equilibria. In a large number of developing countries that became independent, and that's also true for the Middle East, in the 1950s and 60s, a series of coups swept through the region, and these coups had an implicit or explicit sanction of the United States because, of course, it was very much about what side you are on, whether Cold War, you're standing on the sides of the Soviets or the US. The 1979 Iranian Revolution, 1991 Gulf War, and so on, they have had impact on domestic power balance in different regions, and particularly in the Middle East. And clearly, one can think about external as entering at particular moments in time and reinforcing the existing or disturbing the existing power balance. External, of course, can also work through the cognitive domain because, institutional analysis is about actors, about bargaining, about cooperation or lack of cooperation, about the strategies they use, the constraints and preferences they have. And here, mental models matter a great deal, your worldview, your beliefs based on past actions, and indeed that can reinforce, and it's almost like you have a regime of compliance without command. Now, of course, the ways in which the internal and the external interact can be determined on a zone, on a continuum. There are certain states where actually the internal and external are co-produced. They're inseparable from each other. And indeed, there are lots of economies, resource-rich economies, where you have very high level of natural resources, relatively small populations, lots of conflict, and lots of foreign military presence. These are places where you see the internal and the external being co-produced. And in thinking about this, I would like to refer to this rentier state theory, this analytical paradigm that political scientists talk about. And there, the explanation for the stability of authoritarian regimes is very much predicated on domestic cycling of rents. That dictators survive by distributing rents amongst their domestic constituents. But actually, there is an external side of that bargain as well, because there are lots of ways in which rents are recycled in the global system through recycling of petrodollars, overseas investments, acquisition of companies, business contracts, arms purchases, investment in stock markets. And a lot of these cross-border flows are not simply determined by rational economic logic alone. They also carry geopolitical returns. You can think about defense spending as being one such component. I mean, since the Arab Spring, Arab states have increased expenditures on defense, and by the way, that's not all geared towards domestic security. Quite a lot of it is towards buying of arms and equipment from states abroad. So let me conclude by thinking about where we are. I mean, this is a very initial mapping of the field, and it is not offering an alternative to mainstream institutional analysis. We hope to enrich existing accounts of domestic institutional change. So it's very much complementary to the modern institutional project. External, in a sense, is part of how mainstream political economy talks about de facto power. When you map de facto power within societies, external is very much part of that milieu in many, many societies. So if you want to talk about institutional change in Lebanon, you cannot talk about institutional change in Lebanon unless you take into account the external environment, because a lot of regional and international players sort out their struggles inside the Lebanese political domain. If you talk about political change in Egypt or Pakistan, lots of other states, the external interacts in very complex ways, and it's not an additional variable, it's part of the very constitution of power, it's part of the very way power is constituted. And this clearly is an interdisciplinary endeavor. And once you start thinking about these complex interactions, you actually try and bring together IR, economics, political science, insights from these various disciplines that can contribute to our understanding of de facto power. And of course, this can have dramatic implications for policy reform, because there's a lot of contemporary discourse on democratization, on weak and fragile states, where there are international actors who completely insulate themselves from the domestic field, and then think from 13,000 feet, and that's really not the case in many societies, where foreign actors are active players in the field, and they should be problematized as part of the domestic institutional equilibrium. And I'll finish there.
I'll try not to make my presentation too dense in terms of information. I'm going to take a very broad overview over the history of the Taliban movement, including the kind of maligned prehistory of the movement pre-1994. I'll kind of dip into various moments along the way, looking at their attitudes towards religion and their actions in terms of kind of religious presentation in an outward sense. Of course, all of this has a relevance to questions of Taliban autonomy, to what extent they exist anymore, whether we can talk of the Taliban as a movement, as well as some kind of side concerns of the extent to which external powers or even the Afghan government can interact with them as a movement. I think all of this has a relation to how they've kind of changed their attitude towards religion and the reasons for that as well. And as we've heard over previous days, previous presentations yesterday and today, something which I'd like to try and bring out through this presentation is the way that too often what we think of as religious movements are in fact powered by the dynamics of power rather than religious ideology. And I think this is often missing from, certainly from the popular discourse about the Taliban, but also in the academic study. Before we get all of that, I think there's a general problem we have whenever we talk about the Afghan Taliban, that we have to kind of go back to basics. We have this accumulation of sediment of knowledge and of rhetoric, popular discourse, which has kind of accrued over our understanding of the Taliban. And I think it's always a good idea to very much kind of start at the beginning of the movement, start at the beginning of the history, since so much of what has been said and written about them bears little resemblance to reality. So what we're talking about in this presentation is who do we mean when we're talking about the Taliban? Who are they? What do they represent? Do they represent religious ideology? Do they represent a political force? Are they possibly an ethnic group? These are all questions which haven't been exhaustively answered in the literature. And certainly, we can ask: is the group who the Taliban were during the 1980s and 1990s? Is it the same group, or are there splits, or are there differences within kind of fragmented forces within the Taliban? There's a completely separate presentation, and I think the presentation that follows mine will get into this a little bit as to why we're in this mess of not knowing very much about the Afghan Taliban, despite years spent there and ostensibly hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars being spent on research relating to the movement. It's partly a question of bad sources or no sources at all, limited amounts of field work getting done, as Professor Levin mentioned earlier. The Afghan Taliban, of course, to some extent muster a kind of intentional veil of secrecy over the movement, in part for operational reasons and in part just that's the character of who they were. They didn't want to draw attention to themselves, but rather to their actions. At least this was the case during the 1990s government. And then, of course, you have kind of more malevolent aspects of the historiography of the Taliban, where people ignore evidence or just make things up. And as a result of all of these things, particularly as a result of the lack of fieldwork and people spending time either with Taliban members or in the places where they grew up in the environments and this kind of rich context, the evidence which people do find, whether it's written or kind of audio or videos they find online, it's very easy to misinterpret these things if you don't know the context in which they were made. Luckily, there are a number of kind of new sources of evidence which are starting to be written or published. I've been working on this archive project. We have hundreds of thousands of pages of original Taliban documents and newspapers which have all been digitized, and roughly 3 million words of them have been translated. And that'll all go up online for students and budding PhD students perhaps to analyze. You know, a lot of people have been involved in trying to encourage Talibs to write their own memoirs, to tell their own stories, something which initially they weren't really inclined to do, but more and more we have memoirs and kind of some semi-oral histories starting to be collected. There are also other completely unexplored treasure troves of material, the entire radio archives of the Taliban government during the late 1990s. This is all preserved in the Ministry of Information. It's just there are exorbitant charges to use it. So at some point this will get hopefully studied. And we have kind of micro accounts from scholars and histories of very specific places based on new oral history evidence, in particular from southern Afghanistan, which is starting to come out. So maybe a little too late, but never too late, I would say. The main argument I'm trying to get to, and this, by the way, is a photograph of the Taliban graveyard outside Kandahar, where a number of senior leaders are buried. And then later on, after the 2001 initial military action, a number of the people who were killed in the initial fighting were also buried there. So it's known as the Taliban graveyard in Kandahar. And it brings together thus, you know, this kind of post-2001 Taliban with the original group which were responsible for fighting against the Soviets during the 80s and later in the government in the 1990s. So what I want to look at today is to take a kind of shift away from the debates, to explore the shift away from debates about religion and ideology within the movement towards the kind of pragmatics and calculations of politics on the national level, as well as the kind of local power games that the Taliban have employed since the 1980s. Before I get into that, one or two caveats. I'm talking mainly about the senior leadership, the kind of thought leaders within the movement. Don't have time, and in fact it's very difficult to have a sense, certainly, of the kind of rank and file Taliban members during the 1980s and 1990s versus the people who we may have access to now. I'm looking at the things they said and they did because I can't really claim to represent their interior thought process at the time. I'm trying to give a narrative of individuals taking action rather than a kind of impersonal narrative of faceless forces. And of course there are competing motivations and things which I may say in a rather blanket way are much more muddled and confused when you look at it in detail. I've also shied away from presenting poems and songs written by the Taliban as evidence for some of my points, but I think certainly if you go back and you look, you can find the evidence there for what I'm going to talk about. If our story has a beginning, the background to the modern Afghan Taliban movement should be found and located in the 1980s jihad against the Soviet forces and the Afghan government. Solidarity was forced in the Sangar, or the trench, in Greater Kandahar, not in the madrasa networks. This is kind of one of the initial misconceptions that people have, that the Taliban were formed out of madrasa networks in Pakistan, whereas actually it was places like this. This is Zangiabad to the west of Kandahar city, which was a very, very important place for a number of the people who would then come to lead the Afghan Taliban movement. They all fought together in this kind of triangle area west of Kandahar city. And just to set the scene, I'll quote from an account of two Mujahideen assassins, which was written and published in 1985. They were beautiful flowers of the jihad, however, and Kandahar's gardens, green trenches, real heroes. They were butterflies drunk on their love of Islam and the homeland, who eventually burnt themselves on the bright candle and reached the summit of their love. Both of these mujahids had done strange things. Their area of jihad was from the Sanjare public road until Sangisar. The Russians' big convoys were not safe from their attacks. Mullah Nek Muhammad Akhund had held out with his jihad for hours against an entire convoy. Mullah Nek Muhammad Akhund had strange thoughts. This hero mujahid would smear his face and head with mud and also his body. After that, he would become a friend to walls. Sometimes you would see him lying near a wall or hiding behind a wall and looking around secretly. Sometimes he would be standing on the wall and bringing fire to bear on the enemy. The bloody enemy couldn't catch this hero of our jihad despite their smartness and all their efforts. This language is very much in common with other Mujahideen era accounts where miracle stories and analogies to the time of the Prophet or stories from the Hadith record are referenced frequently. And in fact, a lot of this was taken from the kind of cultural heritage that Afghanistan has a particular large and kind of rich repository of. But Islamic rhetoric and debate was very much at the forefront of what they were doing during the 1980s. It functioned both as a source of reassurance and also justification for them. Religion was very much an important source of motivation and kind of rhetorical discussion point. They used to have study sessions. They were kind of different from the other Mujahideen fronts in the areas because they would insist in people studied while they were fighting as well. So they would fight during the day and then at night they would study. The others wouldn't do this. So the Taliban was seen as a kind of bookish group of people and really you wouldn't join them unless you were really committed to this particular path. In fact, the memoirs which have started now to be written by Talibs are filled with these miracle stories. And when you talk to people who are involved then, they really remember the time. It felt like they were going up against kind of certain death against the Soviet military machine. They weren't very concerned with politics, political discourse, with the future shape of the country. They felt they were doing their bit. They felt they were engaged in their religious obligation. And this was essentially their world. Of course, this isn't to forget the kind of local reasons for people signing up and going to fight in certain areas. There were tribal issues and kind of local politics involved. But religion really was the main focus for them, and a kind of wider political aims wasn't really part of it. By 1994, the Taliban were in the process of taking southern Afghanistan with rhetoric that emphasized the restoration of security and justice. They were ostensibly apolitical at the beginning. Even they were gesturing towards the possible return of the king, at least before the movement took Kabul in 1996. And if I'll just read a tiny bit from the Taliban leader, Mullah Muhammad Omar, talking about the founding of the Taliban. We began by visiting the students in the schools and the study circles in the morning of that day, and we went to a study circle in which approximately 14 individuals were studying. Then I gathered them in a circle around me, and I said to them, "The religion of Allah is being stepped on. The people are openly displaying evil. The people of religion are hiding their religion, and the evil ones have taken control over the whole area. They steal the people's money, they attack their honor on the main street, they kill people and put them against the rocks on the side of the road. And the cars pass by and see the dead bodies on the side of the road, and no one dares to bury them on the earth." I said to them, "It is not possible to continue studying in this situation, and these problems will not be solved by slogans that are not backed up. We, the students, want to stand up against this corruption. If you truly want to work for the religion of Allah, then we must leave our studies temporarily. And I will be honest with you, no one has promised to help us even with 1 rupee. So you will not assume that we will provide food for you. Rather, we will request food and help from the people." I said, "This is not the work of a day, nor a week, nor a month, nor a year. It will take a long time. Are you able to perform this or not?" This now it starts to become a kind of far more practically oriented vision of the problem and what they intended to do to solve it. You still see some traces of the kind of religious rhetoric in there, but it's starting to kind of be elided. And in fact, it took the realities of ruling the country to shift this limited viewpoint into something that was often less willing to give time to religious slogans. By 1998, in fact, the Taliban's official web presence listed their goals as a government. And this is a kind of archived copy of that website. And if you read some of the items there, it's support for the UN and Islamic Conference peace efforts, respect for UN rules and principles, protection of human rights and liberties, efforts to combat production and consumption of illicit drugs. This does not read at all like the religious rhetoric, the kind of things that we heard 4 years earlier from Mullah Muhammad Omar. In fact, by this point, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who helped draft this text, had really started to absorb the logic and form of international affairs, and also the kind of the protocols relation to that. And if this was the only thing that you read about the Taliban in 1998, you'd have a very kind of an impression of them which was different, I think, from the reality of what was going on in the ground. We also have to consider the presence of the Taliban's Amr bil Ma'ruf ministry. This, after all, is what many people associate with the Taliban during the late 1990s and early 2000s. These were prominently found in urban centers, and they were the only ministry that answered directly to Mullah Muhammad Omar. It's quite difficult to know exactly where to place them, and a lot more research needs to be done. On the one hand, they were to some extent externally inspired, a mix of Saudi and Pakistani influence. And in fact, if you look at the wording of the charter of the founding of the ministry closely, you'll see that it resembles very much the charter, the current charter of the Saudi Amr bil Ma'ruf. It was a group, a center of power that was personally supported by Mullah Muhammad Omar, and it functioned as an extension of his power. But the kinds of people who were administering this were very much the kind of gunmen or gangsters who had been active in the pre-Taliban period. And quite often Mullah Muhammad Omar would have to intervene to stop the excesses of this group, and he had a lot of problems with kind of internal cohesiveness of the movement because of the Amr bil Ma'ruf, because they started taking kind of liberties. So despite some religious motivation and exhortation in the mix, it wasn't really the primary focus for the movement, and for some it wasn't really much of a focus at all. What I want to do now is skip forward to the post-2001 period, just to highlight some examples of the Taliban essentially avoiding religious rhetoric completely. And in fact, I'll skip all the way to May 2010, where the Taliban were issuing a third version of their rule book. This is a kind of internal document to discipline the group, because they were very much worried that things were starting to fragment and people weren't obeying orders from the senior leadership. This version, the third version, was more or less rewritten and expanded from scratch. And by this point, there's very little gesturing to religious rhetoric at all. And in fact, it's kind of very interesting. At the beginning, very beginning, they're introduced by talking about the obligations of jihad. And then later on, they start talking about some of the rules, and they're talking about what happens when you capture a particular prisoner. And in this first rule of dozens of pages, they list the hadith reference supporting this particular rule. And then for the rest of it, they don't list any of their kind of religious supporting arguments. And I've spoken to people who are involved in this, and they say essentially they decided it was too much work, and so they didn't bother to do the rest of it. But they left that one in as a kind of a trace, a kind of a hand gesture towards their religious training. So you see it's almost kind of fallen off the agenda completely. The same issue came up in November 2012 when former Mujahideen Party leader Abdul Rasul Sayyaf gave a televised speech in which he challenged the Taliban to provide a religious justification for their use of suicide attacks. And this was a very kind of strong challenge which he made in a live television speech. And it was very challenging for the senior Taliban leadership, who in fact completely avoided the issue, even though it was very much discussed at the time, until some months later. They in fact released two statements later on, but they were very half-hearted, produced very little kind of religious evidence or kind of scriptural basis for as they in fact had been challenged to do. So it was very much seen as a kind of a snub to them. The fact, and in fact, they're not very interested in providing that kind of religious justification for things, because simply the conflict has developed its own logic at the moment. It's not really, as I've been trying to talk about, it's not really about religion anymore. It's about power, it's about military politics. And to take this all the way up to the present day, the most kind of recent statement by the Taliban leader, Mullah Muhammad Omar, he delivered his Eid sermon, as he does twice a year, and there's almost no religious rhetoric in this at all. It functions as a kind of political call to arms for the Taliban and for the troops on the ground, and includes some kind of remarks for foreign policy scholars. I'm more or less out of time. So the Taliban leadership that we have at the moment, it's split into all sorts of different groups. You have the old generation, you have younger generation fighters on the ground, you have new currents coming in from outside. There's been a lot written about possible relationship between the Taliban and Dawla Islamiyya in Iraq, and that I think what's going on there. There's a particular character who's trying to create a relationship from Afghanistan outwards rather than things coming in. But they have because the fragmentation exists within the movement. They have different strands, some of whom are trying to revive this religious rhetoric as a very much a core of the movement, some of whom are trying to be much more pragmatic. Nevertheless, a lot more study is still needed. If there are any more questions, we can talk about it afterwards. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is the last presentation, and I am aware that we're all very tired. In the inaugural, there was this mention of the thick soup, and I would try to make it very light because we have had many, many main courses in between. Two curtain raisers helpful in thinking about this power-knowledge relation. The first I take from Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, also who wrote Alice in Wonderland. And this gives me inspiration to understand this knowledge-power relation. There is a dialogue between Alice and this character Humpty Dumpty, apparently very powerful. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said, in a rather scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, Humpty Dumpty said, which is to be master. That's all. So if you're a master, you can actually put whatever meaning into words and the whole thing. The second inspiration follows from Chekhov's story titled A Chameleon. It is helpful in interpreting the changing stances of scholars around the changing knowledge strategies of global power. In the story, a state official on a routine round of a locality spots a crowd of people circling around a dog who is alleged to have bitten a man. In the first instance, the superintendent thinks that the dog was an ordinary street dog. But then someone from the crowd suggests the dog's owner is a military general. The police official's behavior changes with change in the knowledge about the dog's belonging. And this is how it happens in the story. Perception of the dog, dog's belonging, and this version keeps going up and down. Just a broad stroke, this whole distinction between moderate Islam and radical Islam, or Islam, one doesn't talk about Islam in covert operation, so its reflection in scholarship is exactly the way the situation actually demands what should be the stance of the scholars. Now, the scholarly narratives on the last decade of Cold War, or the great game in Obama's AFPAC region, underrepresent the interplay of power and knowledge as input in the global power operations. Power needs weapons of mass destruction and also discursive instruments of mass consensus. In the contemporary situation, the globally powerful nations of the world, in defending their national interests abroad, need the continuous consent of the ordinary people around in one's own country and those in far places for spending national wealth on war operations, on protecting their national interests and security inside poor countries whose own interests or security subsists on their powerful patrons. The present paper selects studies on madrasas, the outcome of significant conferences held after 9/11, and the writings of various observers and participants in the Afghan jihad during the 1980s. And I'll take you quickly through this. The ulama in contemporary Islam, custodians of change. This is Qasim Zama, 2002. Denizens of the Alien World, a study of education, inequality, and polarization. And Tariq Rahman is so surprised by the radical Islam and even Taliban that he calls them denizens, a world he doesn't know, alien world. Bastions of believers. Who are these people? In fortresses which just cannot be cracked, and it appears as if they have spontaneously emerged, and that it has no prehistory, perhaps. Madrasas in Asia, political activism and transnational linkages. Transnational linkages, all that was the entire Afghan jihad was about transnational linkages, but with a child's eye, with all innocence, 2008, one is actually examining if at all there is transnational linkage. Guardians of Faith in Modern Times, this is of course a historical study, 2009, but they're all talking about madrasas and madrasas in various dimensions, Islam and education. This is conflict and conformity in Pakistan madrasas, Islamic education in Soviet Union and its successor states. This is really slightly different from other studies, but this is really creating or reinforcing this theme, which is now very fashionable. Trajectories of education in the Arab world, again, the same theme worked out in a different terrain. The moral economy of Madrasa Islam in education today, 2011. Now, while all this is happening, you have another. This actually is almost a forgotten text. Afghanistan travels with Mujahideen Sandigol, and it has a preface from Margaret Thatcher saying that these Mujahideens are in fact freedom fighters. Britain most of the time provides a matching grant to United States. In fact, this happened earlier. The US President Ronald Reagan compares Afghan Mujahideen with the Americans' founding father. This is 1985. And this is, of course, really much later that it appears in the public sphere. Also, around the same time, this is General Akhtar Abdur Rahman, who was a main architect behind Afghan jihad, very self-effacing person. And this is the study that actually shows how this jihad was brokered globally and produced locally. Taliban phenomenon, this is Kamal Matinuddin, and he goes into great details as to this entire Taliban phenomenon. This is a reprint of Yusuf's memoirs. Ghost War and Devil's Game, these two studies, these two books, really, they don't come from university presses, but they draw upon material which shows how this whole story is constructed. Again, the interplay between the external and internal in Dr. Malik's language. The Undeniable Agent, well, after this entire this is post-2001, the entire Afghan jihad had to be dismantled, decommissioned, and while most of these studies on social reform of madrasas is really about buying back mentality, but there was something else to be bought back, and those were the weapons that were introduced into the whole situation during the 80s. This is again Yusuf's memoirs, and this is the arc of stability or arc of crisis, which actually is more of a broad metaphor. Brzezinski, security advisor, and he suggests how this entire area is really woven together and is a useful site for co-production of jihad. That Brzezinski's arc of Islam really now comes as arc of representation of madrasa studies. If you put together all these madrasa studies and we raise the question, what are the various contexts which are being studied, they actually redraw. This is the notion of landscaping I heard yesterday. It's redrawing the entire thing on a different plane. And these are the locations of madrasas in South Asia and Southeast Asia, part of the redrawn arc of Islam. This is Africa and Central Asia. Now, all these studies were also, these were edited, and those who actually did the case studies, they were not those who organized the, or anchored those studies in the wider picture. So those who were high on speculation, high on suggesting that these conferences and these studies on madrasas are anchored in the events around 9/11, these directors, these knowledge directors or editors were also, they were not doing the research. In fact, the knowledge workers were different from the knowledge directors. Oh, yeah, sorry. Okay, that's much for the appetizer. Now, the thematic dissonance in the two streams of scholarly writings provides the initial puzzle for the present study. In tracking the genealogy of the two sets of writings, the present argument faces 4 questions that help unfold the dramatic interplay of knowledge-power complex on the tracks of recent history in Afghanistan, Pakistan. 4 questions. 1, why do accounts of madrasas in post-9/11 in the context of Afghanistan, Pakistan acquire excessive prominence among sociologists, social anthropologists, historians, and political scientists? The second question is about the processes that bring the madrasas to the attention and for the scholarly comment. The third question, how to make sense of the thematically opposed writings in the decade following 9/11. One trying to suggest that there is an interplay between the secular and the sacred factors, the other saying that there is a dissonance. Broadly speaking, the two discrepant trends in scholarly writings need to be analyzed together. One set of writings are premised on the modernity-tradition divide or the secular-religious dichotomy in the role of madrasas in religiously motivated violence. The second set of writings seek to capture the account of cooperation between the secular and the religious actors in setting up jihad that involved the international networks of fighters, part of the Great Game in Afghanistan up to 1989. And finally, the paper examines the bearing of intern knowledge, classified, censored, or partially disclosed during the 1980s, upon the perspectives and conceptual tools of social science research. In the present analysis, these studies follow 4 different knowledge strategies for securing legitimate outcomes of what has happened between the decade 80s up to the present in the battle. The first strategy was to positively control critical knowledge. by keeping the power operations covert during the 80s. In this period, knowledge produced about Islam by scholars is ignorant of actual power operations. So Akbar S. Ahmed, 1987, his famous book, very interesting actually, no one reads now, but it's really a goldmine for me, Toward Islamic Anthropology, definition, dogma, and directions. Not just Islamic anthropology, there are accounts, in fact, oral accounts, that there was a proposal to study Islamic economics, Islamic psychology, Islamic physics, Islamic astrology, etc. The study of Muslim groups by scholars committed to the, in fact, this is Akbar S. Ahmed trying to say what exactly is Islamic anthropology. The study of Muslim groups by scholars committed to the universalistic principles of Islam, humanity, knowledge, tolerance, relating micro-village tribal studies, in particular to the larger historical and ideological frames of Islam. Please imagine, 1980s, Akbar S. Ahmed writing on Islamic anthropology. This is the time when serious covert operation is taking place. Millions of dollars have been pumped into Pakistan. And Islamization of society is a grand project Ziaul Haq is forging. And then Akbar S. Ahmed is also writing about Islamic anthropology. And I thought, this is really such a beautiful picture that emerges. Imagine a 3-storied building. And I'm actually drawing my picture from a Bollywood film where there is a 3-storied building and a murder takes place in the basement. But the murderer is actually very clever. When he shoots, he makes sure that on the first floor, this sound of shooting harmonizes with sound of the crackers. And on the third floor, or second floor, there are religious scholars saying, what is light? And this is really the 80s scenario. Basement, covert operation, first floor, institutional linkages, and on the second floor, scholars talking about Islamic economics and Islamic psychology, and of course, Islamic anthropology. It is, well, in some sense, for Bollywood film, the cracker, the harmonizing of cracker sound and pistol shot was really to deflect attention of those who were worried about what has happened. I think this was an attention-deflecting strategy. The second knowledge strategy involves fracturing the causal sequence of events by glossing over or weakening the powerful causes and overplaying the role of mentality and motivations of the serving actors. So there is a whole literature on jihadi mentality. In fact, what causes Islamic radicalism, which is a social science question, is then actually taken into the realm of study of mentality and the tradition of mentality. The powerful actors' complicity in the co-production of the problem, say Islamic radicalism, which I still don't know what it means. And this is then reduced to accounts, in the words of Oxford historian Faisal Devji, effects without causes. The phrase used in a celebrated book on jihad. This strategy relates the events in the representational space by changing the level of human reality from actors to impersonal processes. According to Jean Baudrillard, substituting the signs of the real for the real, or Frederick Jameson, derealization of the reality. The third strategy in knowledge production for legitimating knowledge is to actively reconfigure the serving actors and their tools to pathologize a section of reality which is then to be reformed. The story of madrasas in recent history, especially at the culmination of the Cold War, bear a strong print of what is termed the Afghan jihad against the Soviet Union. During the period, madrasas were mobilized, and then after the Great Game was over, the global players sought to immobilize, or in military terminology, decommission the instrument. The hallmark of 1980s project of jihad was a covert operation outside the US Congress up until the mid-80s. And for this reason, much of the event was kept under guarded secret. Much later, as positive information control, willing scholars put together an official version of what had happened. So it's a reverse of the confiscation of intellectuals being talked about yesterday on a scale. There is a Persian Sufi couplet's example where a deer actively chases the hunter to be hunted out. It's that kind of scenario. Each of the study on madrasa, broadly speaking, consists of two sets of writings. One by the director, editors, patrons of the study, and two, the actual case studies by the individuals. And there are implications of how, of a covert operation for historians and social anthropologists who have to work through the voices that are generally incomplete, silenced, or prevented from being documented. In the interplay between the classified and the declassified information, the gatekeepers of knowledge ensure that sufficient time is maintained between secrecy and its disclosure so as to manage the account of history without loss of official face. This is almost equivalent to a wartime deception. And it is possible to say after the fact that a reference to international network of political activists organized around jihad began to get noticed in social science scholarship not at the point of their birth, but actually at the time of their refusal to get dismantled or die. Last point. Knowledge in the service of power distorts the tools of social sciences. And the example that comes to my mind is really using a kitchen knife to unblock the drain pipe. It gets dirty. It needs to be actually cleaned. The upshot of this exercise really is to revisit the perspectives that were used and reconstruct. Perhaps this would clarify some of the debates that are mostly speculative at this stage. Thank you.